Hello and welcome to Lesson 2, Approaches of Wilhem Wundt and Introspection. So you need to know the origins of psychology, the establishment of psychology as a discipline by Wilhem Wundt, and his method of introspection. You also need to understand how psychology emerged as a science, and we'll cover all this in today's session. So some key terms to get started with. We have the scientific method. This is the process by which or through which all sciences go. It involves some key ideas like objectivity. So if you're making observations, they need to be objective, systematic, you don't miss things out, and they need to be replicable. And this is really important because you don't know that your findings aren't just a fluke, aren't just caused by something other than the variables you try and manipulate. Empiricism. Empiricism is the philosophical approach to how we gather knowledge. And it argues that we primarily gather knowledge through experience. And a large part of that is through the senses. So it's we learn through experience. We gather information about the world via experience. Introspection is the method that Wundt used, and we'll be talking about it a lot, but essentially it involves directing your conscious awareness inwards to analyze your mental and emotional states. Okay, Wilhem Wundt, the father of modern psychology. So he lived 1832 to 1920. He was a German physiologist, a physician, and a philosopher. So you'll find a lot of the early psychologists were actually naturalists. They had training in physics, biology, chemistry. They were medical doctors, people like Freud, for example. Considered psychology as science himself and set out to make his investigations as rigorous and robust as possible. He was interested in things like thoughts, perceptions, and feelings. And his main contributions were to establish experimental psychology. Some of the modern research methods that we use today, they're not many. Wilhem Wundt, his main achievement is that he opened the first experimental psychology lab in the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1879. A little on the history and context then. In 1879 he established the first experimental psychological laboratory. Wundt had a degree in medicine and a particular interest in certain areas of physiology. He was quite enamoured by the idea of sensory processes. How do we process information through the senses? This led him to an interest in psychology, and overall he published 500 articles and books in his lifetime, which is substantial. He published a key text in 1874 called the Principles of Physiological Psychology. And really, the purpose of this book was to treat psychology in a more scientific way and to establish psychology as a scientific discipline. Wundt collected many types of experimental equipment, and really the reason why he used a laboratory is because he had this big equipment and he kept it in storage in the lab space, so that instead of hosting his lectures in his classroom, he would often bring students down to the lab to experiment. And this is where the lab starts to be used as an environment in which research really takes place. Many of earlier psychologists of sorts would have carried out tests and things in their lecture halls. Some more on the history and context. At the time, the idea that psychology was actually a science was very controversial, and many of Wundt's colleagues rejected the idea. He was very much interested in this idea of holistic psychology. And Edward Titchener, who was a British psychologist, studied under Wundt, and he was responsible for bringing much of Wundt's work to the US and sparking popularity in psychology there. The downside was a lot of Wundt's work was actually mistranslated by Titchener, and that meant that Wundt's approach was kind of misunderstood for a long time. Titchener labelled Wundt's approach as structuralism, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but if you study sociology, you'll look at functionalism and structuralism. In a social context, we have a similar idea in psychology. Introspection then. What is introspection? It means looking into, analysing the contents of the conscious mind. Wundt would basically expose participants to different stimuli and ask questions like, by how much must physical stimuli differ for the experience to be consciously noticeable? So one example is you hold out your hand and I keep adding feathers to your hand. Now you can feel the feathers touching, but imagine I can take that away. At what point would you say, actually this is really heavy, this is too heavy, and things like that. So when do you notice those minute changes? You could do it with colour spectrum as well. When does blue turn into green, or green to blue? Green to blue. Anyway, the participants were not directly observing the perceptions or memory or anything like that. Instead, they were recording their thoughts about them. And this is going to be a problem for us later, because these are constructions. So if I'm thinking about at what point the feathers feel heavier in my hand, I feel that sensation of weight, I'm thinking about that. I'm not directly observing, for example, the messages being sent by the nerves in my hand. Instead, I'm actually imposing a sort of top-down view on it. I'm constructing an idea or a representation of it. This is quite abstract and philosophical. Structuralism then. You don't have to go into detail about this in the exam, but it's a very interesting idea. It's a theory of consciousness, and the idea is that it reduces consciousness to its smallest component that we can be aware of. And then what we do is we sort of take it apart and then analyse how all these different components fit together to make up a conscious experience. Now you could do this yourself. Imagine separating the five senses from a situation. You go out for a nice meal and you're eating a steak or something. It could be halloumi if you're a vegetarian. So you're eating this really nice dish that you're looking forward to, but you're seeing it, you're tasting it, you're feeling it with the proxy, maybe the knife and fork. Hopefully you're not eating it with your hands. You are smelling it, and that's part of the taste as well. Separate out each of those sensations and your thoughts about them, and then see how they all feed together to create conscious experience. That's the purpose of structuralism. Titchener argued that the mind, or our experience, was made up of three ideas really. We have perceptions, ideas and emotions. Each of these elements can be analysed regarding a few characteristics. So we could talk about the quality of an emotion, the duration of emotion. A good one is next time you get angry, just try and be aware of how long you're angry for. Anger always subsides. In fact, to stay angry, you often have to work yourself back up by thinking about the issue again. But at some point, you'll realise you're not angry anymore. And that's because the duration is finite. It's limited. Intensity, how intense? Anger is a good example as well. You know, you can be furious, or you can just be, I'm slightly miffed. And clearness. How clear is a particular emotion or thought or idea? Think about visual imagery in your head. According to Titchener, all thoughts could be broken down into sensations which could themselves be analysed through introspection. Okay, next slide. Elements interacting. So once we've broken this stuff down, we analyse how they interact. So Wundt had this idea of apperception, and what he means by apperception is that we incorporate the new information into old information, and this forms a new whole. So we're never sort of writing over blank CDs. We're just adding what we know. And he uses this example. A rich and a poor man find £100 on the floor. The poor man thinks it's a lot of money to lose. The rich man does not. Okay? So their perception is going to be influenced by their previous experience. So our perception shows how our consciousness is actually affected by our old information. Again, you don't need to know this in any detail, but I find it interesting. Examples then, this is how we could do introspection. We've got some tasks we're going to do in class. Imagine that I give you a pencil. This is one of the more boring tasks, and I ask you to report on the characteristics of the object. So you need to talk about its colour, its length, its texture, things like that. However, you mustn't just say it's a pencil, because that relies on pre-existing knowledge. So one way that Wundt was trying to be objective is by sort of discounting the stuff that we already know. We know it's a pencil. But we need to get away from that, because we want to drill down into these really, really tiny perceptions, tiny introspections, breaking it down to the smallest element we can. So we say, okay, the colour, where it's orange, but it's slightly off orange, and we have this reductionist approach to analysing the raw data. If participants did just say it's a pencil, he called that stimulus error, and they'd be corrected. Emergence of psychology as a science then. So we talked briefly about empiricism, and you remember from the class we talked about the process of psychology developing from the ancient Greeks right up until modern day, and the empiricists were people like John Locke and David Hume and John Stuart Mill and people like that. And then we had Kant come along, and we'll talk about him a bit later. Empiricism is the gathering of knowledge via experience and observation alone. You know, it's through your senses or through experience, but there's no other method. There's no, hand of God delivering information into your brain. They ignored largely, they didn't know about the genetic code, but the empiricists ignored the role of any sort of innate mechanisms would have on you per se. However, some empiricists do say things that happen in your body can produce experience as well. Anyway, Wundt utilised empirical methods to investigate sensation, perception, behaviour and so forth. And this led to psychology emerging as a science. And the reason why is because sciences have two basic assumptions. Every effect has a cause, and that once you know the causal relationship between the two variables, you can make predictions about it. So once Newton discovered, conceptualized gravity, he could make predictions. If I predict that all objects will fall to the ground at the same speed, that's a prediction, then I go out and test it. So we feel the same way in psychology. All behavior has a cause. You might think it's caused by the environment or by your genes or whatever, but it has a cause. And once you understand the cause and the behavior is obviously the effect, then you can make predictions about it. So if I poke you in the eye, you'll scream, is a theory, a scientific theory, because I can actually carry it out. And that relies on cause and effect. This moves psychology from the roots of philosophy about, right into science, where we're making predictions, we're testing those predictions and proving them true or false. Though we're not going to use the word true after this. Alright, some key evaluation points. We'll discuss these in a bit more detail, and there's more flesh in your guide notes. One of the strengths is that it established experimental psychology as a scientific discipline. It's important to be a science. Everyone wants that coveted scientific label, because science has produced the majority of the gains of human civilization. So if you think about medicine, you think about technology, you think about every Name one thing that's made our life better, generally, apart from things like democracy and social movements. Most of the good that's been done for humanity has been a result of a scientific process. And part of the scientific process is an emphasis on tightly controlled experiments, often laboratory experiments. Objectivity is key. That's why you didn't want people thinking about the object as being a pencil, because once you've got a pencil, there's lots of things you already know about pencils, and you might project onto the object that he's actually showing you. He wants you to remain objective. Yeah, I know it's a pencil, but I'm going to separate that and put that aside and just analyse the features. And I'm not going to make any assumptions. So objectivity is key, and we focus on the data rather than the interpretation of the data. Introspection is subjective, and therefore it's unreliable as a method. So one of the biggest weaknesses of Wundt's approach is he wants it to be scientific, but the very method he uses is very unscientific. Two people will give completely different responses to presentation of the same stimuli, which is a problem. You know, if every time you drop the hammer on the floor, sometimes it went down, sometimes it flew up in the sky, sometimes it flew over into a window, and your theory of gravity pulling objects towards the ground would be unreliable, because every time you carry out an experiment, something different happens. There are many unconscious influences that we're not even aware of. Think about choices when you walk into a cinema and you're deciding what film to watch. What led to that final choice? You pick film A over film B. Why? Lots of unconscious things influence you. Reviews that you read, months back. The types of films you generally like. Where did that come from? Your childhood. The sort of friends you're going to see the film with, where you've taken into account maybe that they don't. And there's lots of other influences as well. Elements are still in use to some extent in cognitive psychology. Things like self-talk are still relatively valid. So those are the key evaluation points. You need to flesh them out. Remember, we're going to be using this PEE structure. I'm going to go on about it a lot. But once you get that, that's going to be the ticket for you. You're going to just ace any assessment we give you. So those are the evaluations. And that brings us to the entirety of what you need to know about Wundt, plus obviously the information in your guide notes and any additional research that you do. Let's look at some exam questions. You'll be bringing your answers with you next lesson to class, and we'll go through and build up some really perfect answers off the back of those. So exam questions. You may need to pause to write down every question, so be aware of that. AO1, description. Just a quick recap on this. AO1 requires you to demonstrate your knowledge. Remember, it's about understanding of scientific ideas, processes, techniques, and so forth. The key words are about being concise, using key terminology, writing in a coherent way, using information correctly, but really important as well, being specific and using examples. It's no good just saying introspection is looking within. That's nothing. Introspection is the process of X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. It is sometimes known as looking within, blah, 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 blah. An example of it is blah, blah. All that sort of stuff put together will get you about 2 marks. So you need a lot of information for a relatively few marks. Application then. So this is your second type of question. This is when you're expected to apply information that you know to a particular scenario that you have not seen before. So what we do is questions often say, Johnny went to the supermarket, he bought this brand over this brand, can you explain why? Using this psychological theory. So that's your AO2. And AO3 is evaluation. This where your PEE structure is really important. The rest of it you can just add detail to, but PE is what you need to implement here. An exam style question. So you must answer these questions and bring the answers with you next lesson. Don't write them on the guide notes. Please use a fresh A4 piece of paper. This could be important when it comes to revision, and title it appropriately. Lesson 2, Wundt, Introspection, exam questions, add the date and write in black. Let's get stuck in. So, Millie is asked to do a class presentation on introspection. As part of her presentation, she said introspection is thinking about our own thoughts. After the presentation, her classmates said they'd learned very little. Explain what else Millie could have said. So this is a 4-mark question. You need quite a lot of information there, quite a few examples. If you have a look here, it says the explanation of what else could be said is clear and includes the relevant features of introspection. So that's the bit that you need. Relevant features, an example, and the answer needs to be coherent with the use of key terminology. So have a go at that. You're looking at about a quarter of a page, maybe a bit over that, depending on how big and fast you write. Question 2. Explain Wundt's contribution. Explain Wundt's contribution to the development of psychology, 6 marks. So some of the key ideas that it should include in a good answer is who Wundt was and what he did, his process of introspection. You need to use concept of conscious experience, systematic analysis, training, mental processes, control, and pave the way for. If all those elements are in there, chances are you're going to get 6 marks as long as you've written it coherently. And the final question then, a 4-mark. Evaluate the contribution Wundt has made to the development of psychology. This question doesn't require you to say anything about what Wundt did, though you have mentioned that already in the previous question. It says evaluate, so evaluate is kind of like weighing up the strengths and weaknesses, so it's probably best, given that there's 4 marks, roughly 2 marks per evaluation point. It makes sense to have 1 for and 1 against, but it does say evaluation. If you've got 2 against, that's reasonable. If you probably haven't got 2 for, but you might have. Anyway, so 1 for, 1 against. The point evidence explanation we'll have a look at in a second, but one of the points might be something like, because Wundt emphasised the importance of systematic investigation under controlled conditions, this led to blah blah blah. And you could talk about how that shaped psychology as a science, because that's crucial to the scientific method. And you could have something like negative, that it's subjective or whatever. Now, point evidence explanation, we've talked about this briefly already, but point is you make your claim. So Wundt encouraged the emphasis on systematic blah blah. That's your point. That's just a claim. What you've got to do then is back that up. He did this by X or Y, and then your final point is this matters because. Why does it matter that psychology uses systematic investigation, controlled conditions? Why does it matter? Well, it matters because we want to be a science. So try it out. You should have 2 PE points. Don't worry if you don't nail it first time. This will come with time. So that's question 3. And here's something, an example of PE just to help consolidate in your mind. Pause it if you want to have a look at it. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you in the next lesson. Bye.